Dr. Wilbert and Hoed, which was a researcher also at the EPRC and still working with us somehow. He will be sharing his research on the topic of the age-friendly cycling mobility. What is it and how can it benefit tourist cities? The presentation will last about 30 minutes, and in the remaining time, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. I will remind you that if you'd like to make an intervention, if you could use the Zoom raise a hand function or also use the chat function throughout the presentation. After the presentation, of course, we will address these questions in the Q&A. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will then be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We would also like you to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar and spread the word on the research that Wilbert is doing. So let me present our speaker today. Wilbert is an urban geographer with a core interest in mobility, aging, and urban sustainability. He works at the Rovira Virgili University in Spain, where he is part of the research group on territorial analysis and tourism studies. And he develops his research on the project ENTOURAGE on urban mobility transformations in European cities, European tourist cities, and their effects on the social inclusion of older residents and visitors. In 2018, Wilbert obtained his PhD at Newcastle University, where his thesis focused on the role of urban cycling as facilitator of mobility, well-being, and positive aging over the life course. And like I said, until 2021, Wilbert was a research associate at the European Policies Research Center at the University of Strathclyde and the Delft University of Technology. I will thus give the floor to Wilbert to share his presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liliana. And yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be back. I'm just looking up to sharing my screen. Can you see it in full screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, no need to introduce myself. I think Liliana said all of it. Yeah, also as I just said, I'm really pleased to be back and to keep this connection with EPRC warm. Also, not just with me, but also with the research group that I'm part of now at the Rovira Virgili University, specifically the research group on territorial studies and tourism. I believe you have another colleague of mine lined up in the next seminar, Sinta Sans. So that's great to hear this this connection developing, to be part of it. So today I'll be talking about my research project ENTOURAGE, and I'm very pleased to already be able to share some part of it. I've started it in September. It's a 2-year project, so well, let's say the first quarter has just passed, and yeah, so it nonetheless it's still in the early stages. So any comments, suggestions would be very much welcome. The project ENTOURAGE explores urban transformations and urban mobility issues, specifically in tourist cities. But I would like to say that let's say the focus on these urban mobility issues isn't reserved to just tourist cities, hence the brackets in my title. It investigates the prospects and implications of an age-friendly approach to tourism and mobility, using the age-friendly city framework, and also with the aim to pursue sustainability and compatibility of mobility and tourism with the daily lives of residents. This is basically what I'll be going through today. Some of the key aims, objectives, methods of the project. A little bit about the, let's say, challenges surrounding the project, such as sustainable urban mobility and population aging. Then some comments on the research context and its design, and then the insights. I'll share a couple of things that I've gathered so far. It's not really mature yet, but I think it will be interesting to share in this seminar. And some of the next steps that I'll be taking as part of the rest of the project. So here you see the title and a bit of the focus. It kind of taps into three, let's say, literatures. So mobility studies, tourism geography, and geographies of aging. And here on the right, you can see the partners involved in the project that also largely correspond with the case study cities that I'll look at. So Barcelona being the key case study, which I develop a full multi-method fieldwork, and also with some activities in Venice and in Amsterdam to really have this variety of, let's say, tourist cities. So the aims and objectives of the study, the general aim is to analyze the following urban mobility issues and practices of negotiation of urban space. So first, how other visitors and residents in tourist cities negotiate this and engage in sustainable urban mobility. Then the production of urban space through the perspective of mobile and less mobile communities. And third, the public policy discourses surrounding social inclusion and age diversity. So those discourses underpinning being part of policy strategies of urban transformation and sustainable mobility, and also tourist strategies. So to talk a bit about the context of the project, this is the scale of population aging as a trend around the EU. It's a very recent diagnosis with projections up to 2030. And yeah, you see here the growth, the expected growth of the 65+ age group over the next 8-9 years. In total, a growth of nearly 18%. Largely everywhere there will be a growth, and you see some parts of Europe standing out, and well, yeah, overall quite a high growth of aging as an demographic phenomenon. Not to say, well, of course, emphasizing in a way that this is a good thing. People are getting older and usually healthier while getting older. But when this larger size of the population is of older age, we might have to think or rethink the way we do things, and in this particular case, how we design cities and look at how they are experienced by inhabitants and visitors. So I would like to see aging and mobility, urban mobility issues as combined challenges for cities. Basically for two reasons. First the first reason is space, urban space. So in recent couple of years, and also accelerated by COVID lockdowns, cities have more attention to their public space as an area as space for pedestrians, cyclists, really for the purpose of residents to use that space. And often this increased attention or increased allocation of space goes at the expense of private transport through traffic, for instance, by car, that appears to have little added value for these places and cities. And the likelihood is that this trend will continue because it already started before COVID. And to expand a little bit on this public space issue, I think the quote on the right illustrates this very well, about the sort of hegemonic automobility system that has been like the key driver of urban planning, transport planning for the last, let's say, decades, maybe 80 years. So this has created an allocation or a division of urban space that has been shown capable and maintains itself by spreading worldwide and including a lot of agents and agencies, car drivers, roads, energy supplies, flow of novel objects, technology and science. I think there's a very seminal book by John Urry from 2004 about this. And over the 20th century, automobility became the preeminent form of daily mobility, dominating, well, as a way of using transport, but also dominating those who don't move by cars, and creating the way, or defining the way in which cities were built and expanded. So as Uri describes, this has been this system of automobility has been in a path-dependent state of lock-in since the 1950s, relying on an relatively old technology of the petroleum engine, which is continually reproduced and continued. So this then becomes very difficult to reverse, as billions of people and agencies have adapted to it and built their lives around automobility's sort of strange mixture of coercion and flexibility, sense of freedom, etc. To which the quote on the right really speaks words of. So where does aging come in? As I showed, the trend of population aging brings also accessibility issues and universal accessibility higher to the agenda. And in aging studies and aging policies responding to this, many emphasize the well-being aspects of mobility associated with maintaining social ties, providing access to places that have functional or emotional value. However, in aging studies for a long time, these mobility opportunities were largely premised on automobility opportunities, either as a passenger, using taxi, using cars for people themselves, which is of course unsustainable, but also highly gendered, differentiated by income and education. Hence, I think there's room to interact between those areas and disciplines of aging and urban mobility. And the second reason why those challenges, I think, are really combined is the fact that mobility opportunities and transitions and behavioral changes, that is what exactly many cities are desiring now, are bound up with the life course. And I think also the aging body, and as a wider trend, population aging, are changing the conditions in which mobility is sustained into later life. Basically leading to the consequence that creating or changing, transforming urban space doesn't automatically lead to behavioral change. All these mobility behaviors are really ingrained into people's daily lives, and not everybody will just start to cycle when there is a cycle path on the road, so to say. Recent research and policy attention to active mobility has been really massive in the last couple of years in many cities, showing widespread benefit to population health, emission reduction, quality of life in cities. But at the same time, urban aging scholars are signaling that older people are often recipients of these transformations, and may remain invisible in research on urban change. Relating this to active travel, we know that older people are less likely to be part of active mobility collectives, groups that participate, particularly in cycling. To show a bit of the differences that exist in cycling context, for instance, I kind of chose two typical examples of an area with high cycling and with low cycling, so being the Netherlands and the UK. I think that the graphs are slightly complex, but kind of show exactly what I mean. So let me explain them. So you see here the split between the UK and the Netherlands. Cycling uptake as part of daily trips, spread or separated for men and women, for urban and non-urban and rural areas, and across different age groups. So here you see that first of all, on the y-axis, cycling uptake is rather low or relatively low in the UK, but is still a bit higher among men in urban areas who are of more or less young age, and then drops off in terms of age, and the level of cycling uptake among women is really much lower. On the other hand, on the other side, on the downside, the uptake in the Netherlands is first of all much higher, but is other than in the groups of younger of children and students, it's higher in the older age group of 60 plus than in previous age groups. I think this is a very strong sign that when cycling is sort of normalized and part of something likely to do when going from A to B in cities and elsewhere, that it is actually something that can be, let's say, age friendly. So why does this matter to cities, tourist cities and other cities? To kind of sum up the previous points in this context, a modal shift to active mobility really depends on people's mobile biographies and ability to sustain this mobility behavior into later life. And I think this is a great quote about that the high cycling rate in the Netherlands as part of this analysis is not a result of the large number of people having chosen to give up their cars and start cycling instead, but rather the result of people who grew up cycling and continue to do so. So really thinking about this ability to sustain behavior. Maybe also people in the UK will have cycled when they were younger as kids, as students, but somehow have not sustained it into life afterwards. Then to continue the sum up, it's particularly cycling that has the sort of the health benefits that I just mentioned, but really those benefits are higher among older people than among other groups when taking up cycling. So this, for instance, functions through functional and cognitive health, reduced risk of falling, also in general, not just off the bike, of course, positive effects on mortality and diseases, and reducing negative impacts of sedentary lifestyles. And there is further indication that cycling improves also prevention in the case of Woodcock and colleagues who analyzed the take-up of shared bicycle systems in London. At the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, we know that when low cycling contexts and cities manage to attract more cycling, they don't necessarily attract a more diverse demographic. So including, for instance, older people, but also children and striving for gender balance. What are the consequences of this? Generally, there's limited attention or consideration of the voice of the age extremes, not just older people, but also children and younger people in urban mobility research and policy strategies. Older people, for instance, hardly appear in urban statistics on cycling and micromobility options. And when they do, they show very low uptake, or are portrayed, for instance, as 50 plus, whereas from 50 to, let's say, the highest age group is a very high bracket, so to say, a very large bracket from 50 to 90 or 50 to 100. Similarly, you wouldn't put an age bracket from 10 to 50 because it doesn't make practical sense. Secondly, if then mobility transformations remain age neutral, they tend to favor commuting routes, quick wins, and trust in infrastructural fixes. So rolling out infrastructure, pacifying urban spaces, creating a cycle lane, but to really, let's say, embed cycling into people's daily lives and into of a wider demographic, much more than that is needed. Then as a societal group, older people aren't often explicitly considered in cycling studies. So from cycling mobilities, studying cycling mobilities literature, it's not often an explicit consideration. And when they often contain, or many studies around other people cycling have negative framings or focus on fall risks, accidents, mobility difficulties. These are of course present, but it's kind of easy to focus on them without addressing the structural shortcomings that cause these difficulties, or without considering the widespread health and well-being and functional benefits that also apply to other people. So I think, and the last point here is to emphasize that it's kind of a missed chance to not decouple urban mobility from physical effort, from sensory appeal, from that cycling really, that makes cycling really different from other types of transport, or in extension active mobility. And in this way, kind of reproducing traditional transport values of speed, efficiency, innovation, that are not really in tune with inclusive city life. So here are a few studies that I've mentioned, addressing urban equity through low carbon mobility, focusing on the social landscape of the cities through cycling, and really calling to change what urban mobility is, kind of while taking private cars away from the core, and focusing on what makes mobilities matter, to not just think of it as a functional and rather wasteful activity that you spend time on and nothing else. So from all this, I'm trying to define the concept of age-friendly cycling and what it could mean, and could it be useful, could it be viable for cities and in urban mobility studies. I'm still working on this definition, but I think there are 4 concepts that should be, or elements that should be part of it, which is reducing the emphasis on physical and cognitive effort, which is to move away from speed and efficiency, like I just said, towards maintenance and longevity, to allow for the diversity of ages and abilities, and also physical components such as bike types that are available, and then the focus on quantity, but also of quality of infrastructure. So not just a city putting in a number of kilometers of cycle lanes, but really look at how usable is this for everybody, and not just the people that are currently cycling. So to move a bit to the more, let's say, practical side of this talk, the research context in my project is the tourist city. It's not just a passive backdrop. It's really something that actively comes back. Also, of course, in the lived mobility systems, mobility experiences that I will gather in these cities. It's of course, I'm just listing a couple of things, and of course I could do another talk about the tourist city as a phenomenon and as a sometimes limiting factor to its inhabitants. But usually it's especially pre-pandemic, it consists of intense concentration of visitor flows and visitor economies. After the pandemic, it's likely to return and to touch upon what was over tourism in the years up to 2020. So a couple of components that I've listed here are sort of an idea of struggle or conflict when it comes to urban public space. Mobilities that tourist mobilities that can be exclusionary, reducing accessibility for residents to certain places at certain times, and quality of life in general, and kind of excesses related to it outside the scope of mobility, such as precarity of the labor market that caters to the visitors' economy, housing crisis intensified by the demand of the tourist market on the housing of cities, additional air pollution, and sort of this process of Disneyfication, that the city starts to look more like a theme park in certain parts, at least, than an actual city in which people live. And to identify or to show a bit of scale, in the case of Barcelona, 11 to 14%, based on the season, of trips within the city are tourist related, are done by tourists. So added up with the spatial concentration of them in the historical center and other tourist attraction points, you can imagine the congestion or the additional pressure this creates on the mobility system. And what could age-friendliness kind of offer to this? So based on reviewing the literature on slower and more proximate forms of tourism, there is a potential to decouple tourism from long-distance travel, and to bring this more into balance with the social and environmental values of the destination. This leads to addressing the exclusionary mobilities that reduce residents' accessibility, builds in touristic and recreational activities in everyday mobility, so to have less of a sharp distinction between the normal everyday, let's say, mundane activities and tourism or recreation as something really separate. And also to build in accessibility considerations, not just in the active aging domain, but also in wider urban and tourist strategies. The research design then. So kind of responding to the research questions that I mentioned at the start about urban space negotiation and understanding or better understanding how other people engage in active mobility. I'm starting with an analysis of the policies and the discourses around first of all aging. So how do age-friendly plans, how are they made and built up in cities, and also how, let's say, age-inclusive or considerate other urban strategies are, especially in the domains of urban mobility and tourism. Then to really aim to access the lived experience of mobility and the mobility biographies of individuals that are living these cities. I'm focusing. I'm doing biographical interviews, coupled with smartphone-based geo-tracking, video recorded go-alongs that can feed or that add like an additional way of looking at how practically their daily mobility looks like, and how we can relate, for instance, mobility biography and habits and behaviors from the past to current patterns, and also to future aspirations. So to go through them briefly, the biographical interviews will be with people from over 60 years old who cycle in Barcelona, both visitors and residents. So can we understand, is the aim of those interviews, can we understand the social relations by looking at how they change across people's lives? In other words, putting mobility and cycling mobility central, but without ignoring let's say the wider life course, other mobilities, life events, features of the built environment that affect their experience and their behavior, and also the aging process itself and future mobility aspirations. Then to inquire how life events interact with people's mobility behavior, emphasize really the transitions and trajectories of mobility, and create room for people's lived experiences and personal histories that often remain a bit hidden in a group of, let's say, older aged people who cycle. Then the the next sort of additional method, I think the biographical part I would say would be the core part. But the part of geo-tracking and go-alongs is really essential to relate it to actually an observed mobility behavior. So to access this mobile experience, we are talking about something mobile. So I think it's important to access this within or while being mobile as well. So this is basically how it looks like, collecting mobility data over a certain amount of time, reviewing this with the participants in a sort of feedback interview, and if possible also to write together with them. So this is from a previous research, and this approach I will more or less repeat in my upcoming fieldwork. So this is really how these feedback interviews look like. Also people being able to comment on their experiences on the, let's say, on the go. So people are equipped with a microphone and will be able to talk about what they see and what they do as they cycle. Then I would give you to close off. I think if I have maybe a few more minutes or maybe 5, that will be the maximum. I think would be nice to also give you a bit of a more concrete flavor of what is coming out of my project so far. So what I did start thus far is this sort of critical discourse approach to analyzing policy strategies. So kind of within the triangle of urban aging, mobility strategies and tourism strategies in the different case study cities. And I would like to report a couple of themes that are coming out from doing this in Barcelona and Amsterdam, and having spoken to a number of policymakers in Barcelona in each of these 3 domains. So first of all, there is a governance, or there are some changes in governance and also some coordination issues that are that I've identified. So some of the changes are like institutional shifts, inclusion or sensibilization of neoliberal actors in policy strategies, such as tourist marketing bodies being part of the urban designing the urban policies, and also the delegation of tasks to the, let's say, supra-urban or regional level, such as in the case of Barcelona to the regional cooperation body and to the province. There's I think in some of the strategies, I think there was a very good diagnosis and evidence-based approach to policy making. But there were also some, let's say, incongruencies and policy silos that appeared. So, for instance, mobility strategies, sustainable urban mobility plans, being presented as inclusive, nonetheless, age inclusion or age groups were never mentioned or related to, even though the plans in there have clear, let's say, age-specific effects of certain ages being more likely to take up or to benefit from the urban transformations presented. And also the other way around, the aging strategies analyzed really focus, for instance, when it comes to mobility, on bus travel and walking for other people, without really trying to make a bridge to an integrated or a multimodal approach to mobility and accessibility. So I've put here a couple of quotes kind of related to policy initiatives that focus on street pacification, that there's often a mismatch between, let's say, policy impacts between, or the mismatch between who are they intended for and who they affect on the ground. For instance, an aging policy to make a certain space more accessible will also affect, of course, the experience of the city for visitors and tourists. Outside, of course, the focus on aging and older people. I think there's a second point that is also interesting to highlight here, is the sort of maybe missed opportunities between these three policy domains. So mobility strategies intend to stimulate mobility, promote sustainable modes, but not really coupling this with discouraging other modes. And if so, the discouragement is largely financial and not really focusing on providing an integrated alternative to the let's say car dominant system. So mobility strategies then, and including cycling plans, usually aim at infrastructural features such as paths, lanes, number of kilometers, number of parking places. But as I said before, active mobility and behavior change towards active mobility really also depends on cultural, social, educational, and life course features. So there's little mention of how to do that outside infrastructural plans. So what's next? Of course, many of this or all of this really is a work in progress. First of all, the analysis of the age inclusiveness of urban mobility policies will continue in these cities that I mentioned. I will start actually in the next couple of weeks the mixed method fieldwork on other people's mobility experiences and of wider sort of urban transformations happening in the city in Barcelona, both through the perspective of residents and visitors, and continue the analysis of like really specific qualities and barriers to cycling that come up over the life course, and that this fieldwork will really add to as well. So I'd like to finish off with a couple of challenges that hopefully can lead to some discussion and between us. Is first of all sort of how to involve or make a bridge maybe between knowledge that is present in aging studies on how to advance the role of other people, how to think of this in a constructive way and not see aging as a sort of societal burden, but as an opportunity and as a natural process in which our society finds itself at the moment. And while research on urban aging, sort of the other way around, research on urban aging has highlighted the importance of lasting mobility opportunities, highlighting new mobility norms for older people and for the built environment, kind of taking a very integrated perspective on age friendliness. So not just looking at making transport more age friendly, but also accessibility of homes, streets, places of services, accessible public transport, etc. So looking at a bit of a wider scale than just mobility. I think that's something that then urban and mobility studies can really learn from aging, urban aging studies, and for instance the field of social gerontology. Related and a bit more methodological, how to advance the needs and voices of the groups affected by urban mobility transformations. In my case, in the case of my project, older people. This idea of doing of not fully informing or not fully engaging the groups who are most affected by urban transformations kind of creates exclusions of different groups, but also of other age groups. And in the case of cycling, measures like safe and separated infrastructure based on cycling studies matter most to them. So not just to other people, also to women, to children, to parents cycling with children, for instance. How to like extend the co-production approach taken often in urban aging studies into other urban policy domains to really get a grip on how different groups who may currently not cycle or engage so much in active mobility, to make this bridge to those groups too. And then the last point here, the last challenge maybe, is the kind of tourism and urban development which cities may or may not want to promote. So leaving it to promoting tourism as it is, often and still means drawing in the negative externalities that have created this phenomenon of over-tourism, and that change a place for both residents and visitors to really become a place that caters for temporary visitors and reduce, or sometimes, if not done right, this goes at the expense of the livability for residents, hence making it a city that is not really a lively city anymore. This changes the tourism as a product, but in this case we are also talking about urban space and not just a product, something that is part of the lived environment where people live. So on the side of mobility growth and of this growth focus, I think it's also important to say to think about being careful what you wish for. More mobility options, potentially sustainable active mobility options, can still be, if not paired with decreasing other travel modes, can still put an additional strain on the urban space and create or enhance the conflict that exists between travel modes and between, for instance, visitors or tourists and residents. So policy interventions reproducing that perspective would be unlikely to make, for instance, cycling in this case a more inclusive alternative to driving and to using public space. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't know what's the best thing to proceed. I'm happy to take some questions and maybe people can post them in the chat. I could leave the slide up, but I would also like to see your faces again. So shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, I think stopping sharing now is probably best so we can see everyone. And I think we already have a question from John. So go ahead, John.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Wilbert. There's a huge amount in that presentation. That there's a lot that we could potentially ask about. A lot of interesting points that come out. I just want.
John, I think you've muted yourself, John.
Sorry. I just wanted to pick up your point about the focus being on infrastructure rather than on issues like behaviors. And I suppose I had a two-part question in terms of your interview research, focusing on Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Venice. And as I understand it, the cohorts of interviewees will be both residents and visitors. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I was just thinking about the visitors, the older visitors, and I suppose you could think of it as a sort of matrix that you've got those who cycle periodically or regularly at home. So yes, they do, no, they don't. And then whether they cycle when they are visiting a place, yes, they do, no, they don't. And then you've got sort of a series of categories, and you can understand those who cycle at home might well do so when they go abroad because they're comfortable with that. But then there are some who may cycle at home but don't do it when they're visiting because of lack of information, awareness, concern about the quality of infrastructure and so on. And then you've got those who don't cycle regularly at home, but they might do abroad because it's part of the visitor experience and because they're attracted by the quality, the opportunities and so on. So, you've got these different categories. And I wonder if there's any research that's already been done that actually that shed some light on the factors that influence the visitors' decisions to cycle I know this is your partly your PhD, but I wonder whether there are any insight from the existing literature.
So specifically on visitors' use of cycling. Of cycling specifically, not as much. I think often, let's say, municipal transport surveys focus on residents. They focus on people living there and asking them in a sort of census approach, how do you go from A to B? Did you use transport modes, well, in sort of list over the past year or in an average week? Whereas I think on the visitor side, what is often counted is the number of visitors and their spend and the number of overnight stays, but not so much their exact mobility behavior. In wider terms, yes. So to what extent do they use public transport? In the case, the place that I know this about best is Barcelona. So usually a lot of public transport and walking. But cycling isn't really, it's actually lacking of the mobility strategy. So the mobility strategy of Barcelona does a great diagnosis on, and quite rare, of tourists' travel modes used while being in Barcelona. But cycling to go as a recreational activity isn't part of those. And I think maybe it's because it's hard to count. So that's also why we're designing this the study in this way. And I'm actually working with a couple of master students who are now starting to do this this research at bike rentals and hotels to see, well, exactly the kind of collectives that you mentioned. So people who may cycle when they are back in their situation back home, and also in Barcelona or not in Barcelona, and also the other way around, people who might consider cycling in Barcelona during their visit while not cycling at home. That is one of the questions. So specifically think about factors that might influence this. Definitely the situation at home will be something to consider, and maybe also let's say a couple of material things that you cannot ignore, like the material, like the presence or the availability of bikes and bike rentals, bikes that are suitable to use, and the infrastructure of Barcelona, in which I think in the last 5 years they have made great improvements. Yet the, let's say, accessibility to different cyclists or to groups who may not be so likely to cycle is maybe not still slightly limited. So I hope that answers more or less your question. I think this is you're describing exactly almost the setup of the interviews and surveys that we're going to hold. So I guess in a couple of months I can let you know the exact answer.
Thanks, Wilbert.
Thank you. We still have a few minutes for a couple more questions. I thought your presentation was very interesting, also, Wilbert, and it's also good to know that you're kind of exploring uncharted territory in this, even from the first observations that you've had in your interviews, that this might not be so much as a focus for policies and strategies. Is there anyone else that would like to pose a question to Wilbert? Maybe you can also put your email in the chat, Wilbert, in case we run out of time and if someone wants to contact you after.
Yeah, I will.
If there are no more questions at the moment, maybe then I can start by closing the seminar. I appreciate very much your presentation, Wilbert, and for you accepting the invite for today. we also will have, as Wilbert mentioned, another presenter later this month on April 27th from Rovira and Virgili University. This will be Cinta Sanz Ibanez, who will present on tourism regions and transformation, challenges and agency shaping regional development paths. And if you'd like to register for this as well, feel free to contact anyone from EPRC. Marie Devine will be probably the best contact person for this. I see you put your email thing